Today General Hospital will reveal the discovery left Brennan stunned to the point of near paralysis. A cold interruption to the practiced rhythm of a man who had spent years anticipating the worst and still found himself blindsided. The investigative habits that had kept him alive fought their way back through the shock. Verify source provenance. Revalidate the chain of custody on the footage. Interrogate the metadata until it yielded something definitive. None of it softened the blow. Every frame strengthened the same impossible conclusion that Nathan and Peter had not only survived but had ascended, reshaping the ruins of Faison's empire into a colder, tighter machine. Brennan cataloged the possibilities with a clinician's detachment that never reached his pulse. Brainwashing protocols, pharmacological conditioning, grief weaponized as leverage, a death staged with surgical precision, a rescue sold as salvation that became ownership. The scenarios multiplied and converged on the same outcome. The myth of Faison had not ended with a body. It had migrated into an apparatus, and that apparatus now wore to faces that Port Charles once knew. Nathan's name carried a weight that complicated everything. He had represented a direct rebuttal to the cynicism that corrodes law enforcement, principled, visible, predictable in his devotion to order. If a figure like that could be turned, it meant the organization had perfected a conversion pipeline that fused coercion with opportunity. Brennan pictured the exploitation graph as he had sketched it on a whiteboard years earlier, a lattice of vulnerability, notice loss, guilt, survivor's bias, public expectation intertwined with tradecraft vectors like isolation, selective disclosure, and manufactured necessity. In Nathan's case, the graph would run through the civic trust that had embraced him. That trust was now an operational resource. It could open doors the organization's money could not. It could deflect scrutiny. It could reposition real atrocities as heroic necessities. Brennan listed the implications in a precise column and watched the column become a blueprint for disaster. Peter was easier to place and harder to stop. Every prior foul on him traced a signature of opportunism, technical fluency, and a near-religious obsession with narrative control. He did not merely break systems, he edited them, trimming away the parts that would argue with his preferred version of events. In a dual-headed structure, such a temperament could serve as the steward of continuity. Supply lines, black lab procurement, shell company finance, digital disinformation. Recruitment funnels seeded with plausible ideologies. All of it could be synchronized under Peter's custodial paranoia. That left Nathan as the outward posture, the commander whose history could sanitize the enterprise while Peter engineered the invisible throughput that gave it force. The pairing was asymmetrical by design, and the symmetry made it durable. Against that structure, time lost its elasticity. Brennan measured it in exposure risks, in the half-life of secrets, in the distance between knowing and acting that kills operations. If the organization consolidated under two leaders with complementary legitimacy, the next phase would be expansion under cover of humanitarian contracts, privatized security tenders, and targeted destabilization that generated demand for the very services they sold. The geography already reflected it. The camera at the European port did not show a smuggler's chaos but a choreography of secured perimeters, layered overwatch, and logistics that moved like a trained limb. The source from the Middle East did not describe panic back-channel dealing but a procurement cycle with compliance veneers and falsified end-user certificates prepared months in advance. This was not a ghost of Faison's old rage, it was a corporation of menace, and it was early in its growth curve. The response could not be rhetorical. Brennan began by shrinking his universe, the baseline counterintelligence reflex that had saved other missions at the moment they became radioactive. He compartmentalized the evidence into sterile, air-gap containers, built parallel audit trails in case one set was discovered, and stripped his communications down to mechanical redundancy and human couriers whose loyalties were bound to him personally rather than to an institution susceptible to penetration. He set burn thresholds on every cache and trained himself, again, to leave work as if nothing in his hands mattered more than a minor infraction. The theater of normalcy was its own defense when the audience was hunting for deviations. Mapping the enemy's command fabric demanded more than sightings. It required relational texture. Brennan overlaid the new fragments across the historic Faison lattice, legacy smugglers, dormant financier accounts, compromised registrars, and doctors with licenses in jurisdictions where oversight meant little and forgiveness meant less. In the overlap regions he looked for motion in corporations activated after long dormancy, cargo insurers quietly amending exclusions, private terminals installing sensors that only mattered if radiological materials were expected soon. The overlay lit up like a constellation. The old myth had indeed migrated and was teaching itself modern languages. The action plan formed around four decisive axes. The first was confirmation, not only that Nathan and Peter lived, but that they issued orders that moved money, people, and material. Brennan tasked a microcell to build a voice print composite, gate analysis from the port footage, and a behavioral signature derived from timings and roots. The second axis was comms disruption, calibrated not to alarm but to misroute, nudging their encrypted traffic through inspection points disguised as standard network congestion, injecting microscopic delays that accumulated enough to force a procedural deviation, the kind that exposed a fallback channel. The third axis involved jurisdictional traps. Brennan assembled a matrix of countries with extradition agreements, mutual legal assistance treaties, and judges whose reputations for procedural rigor could survive any later revelation of taint. If a footprint crossed the right border at the right hour, a perfectly ordinary court order could fall like a guillotine. The fourth axis was psychological fracture. Two leaders seldom remain perfectly aligned. Somewhere in the division of outward authority and inward control sat a seam that could be widened with carefully seated doubts about loyalty, competence, or long-term goals. Every axis demanded cover stories. Brennan built front companies with histories old enough to survive routine due diligence, staffed them with innocents whose resumes would appear allergic to intrigue, and gave those entities reasons to exist that did not depend on the operation. He programmed a false procurement for a class of sensors that only a handful of labs would require, the kind rumored to be in development by an academic consortium that, in reality, had cancelled the project years earlier. The tender was bait, the shipping routes were corridors, the insurance riders were narrative props. The compliance audit was the stage where Peter would insist on signing a waiver because he hated witnesses. If he signed, the signature would not be the point. The point would be the metadata of his presence, the devices nearby, the relay pattern of encrypted nodes, the way the organization breathed when its custodial brain entered a room. All of this assumed the absence of betrayal on Brennan's side of the mirror, an assumption he refused to make. He scrubbed his own team with the cruelty that only necessity justifies, rotating assignments without notice, cross-checking financials against obscure flood insurance payouts, and overseas tuition remittances that often revealed the unremarked second life of an asset. He faked small losses to see who noticed and who took comfort, then reshaped the roster around the silences. He established a personal failure plan that included the distribution of evidence to independent parties who would hate one another too much to collude, guaranteeing that if he fell, the facts would surface in pieces too jagged to be suppressed. He wrote letters he never wanted mailed and stored them in places he never wanted returned to. The moral calculus refused to stay quiet. Nathan's fall forced it forward. If Nathan was the outward posture, then targeting him required an ethical decision about whether to neutralize or to extract. Extraction implied a belief in reversibility, in the possibility that whatever had been done to him could be undone without breaking what was left. Neutralization ignored that possibility for the sake of minimizing harm downstream. Brennan did not pretend the choice was clean. He left it provisionally unresolved in his plan, conditional on signals he could not yet see, and constructed contingencies that allowed him to shift methods without losing momentum. For Peter, the calculus was simpler. His role as custodian of continuity made him the true engine, and engines are not persuaded. They are disabled, exposed, or removed. Beyond operational detail, Brennan understood the symbolic dimension. Faison's legacy had become a story that taught fear to the right people and permission to the wrong ones. That story needed interruption. A public unmasking at the right altitude would not only degrade the network but also puncture the mythology that fed it. He sketched a disclosure pathway that ran through jurisdictions with press protections and prosecutors indifferent to the social cost of embarrassment. The goal was a controlled, irreversible sunlight that would make recruitment harder and cooperation reputationally expensive. If the apparatus survived the strike, it would survive weakened and visible. And visibility is a tax even the wealthy cannot refuse forever. As the plan hardened, the clock that had felt abstract earlier became a physical sensation, a metronome behind every ordinary sound. Brennan moved through his days with deliberate economy, each action either feeding the operation or carefully not appearing to. He endured the proximity of people he could not trust and the distance of those he wished he could recruit. He forced his mind to dwell not on the image of Nathan at the port or the report of Peter at the table, but on the small, mechanical steps that connect revelation to remedy. In the silence of his office, long after the corridors emptied, he assembled the final checklists that would carry his intent into contact, custody chain protocols, intercept warrants in draft, boarding priorities aligned to the operational axes, recovery teams trained to withstand the scripted chaos that the organization would unleash once it understood it was under attack. The threat had scaled from local pain to global architecture, and the response had to scale with it. By the time Brennan stepped back from the board and allowed himself a single and marked breath, the work had transformed from shock management to resolution. The doubt remained where it belonged, in the costs column he would carry with him to the end of things. The action, finally, no longer belonged to doubt. Somewhere in the field, a convoy would soon take what it thought was a safe turn. Somewhere in a conference room, a man who believed he could edit reality would reach for a pen. Somewhere between those points, the story that had survived a death would discover that survival and inevitability are not synonyms, and that precision, applied with enough patience, can make even a resurrected empire bleed. After Valentine hinted that Caesar Faison's organization had never truly dissolved, Jack Brennan was thrown into a state of suspicion and dread that gripped him with a cold intensity. For years, he had studied the iron-fisted control and merciless cruelty Faison wielded. And the idea that such a network could have survived beyond the man's death was more than unsettling, it was catastrophic. He knew all too well that remnants of power structures, once formed, rarely vanish. Instead, they adapt, mutate, and often reemerge in more insidious forms. Brennan pulled old case files from the vaults, dusted off reports that had long been stamped as closed, and re-examined fragments of intelligence once dismissed as irrelevant. He combed through scraps of information that many within the WSB had considered the detritus of an era gone by. But the deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Cells still active in Europe, shadow operations in the Middle East, and hidden financial trails in South America. Every thread bore the unmistakable signature of Faison's legacy. As he followed these leads, Brennan encountered anomalies that chilled him to the bone. Classified reports described ongoing arms deals, the trafficking of sensitive intelligence, and encrypted communications routed through old channels that should have been shut down years earlier. What disturbed him most was the coding. The cryptographic patterns embedded in the intercepted messages were not random. They were the same linguistic fingerprints once employed by Faison and his bloodline. These were codes thought to have died with him. To see them resurface now meant that someone not only remembered but had inherited the methodology, preserved it with a level of precision that only a successor could maintain. At first, Brennan considered the possibility of imitators. Rival networks often co-opted the mythos of fallen figures to scare enemies and bolster their reputation. But the evidence refused to fit that narrative. The sophistication, the scale, and the consistency of the operations pointed to something far more dangerous, a continuation rather than a copy. The turning point came when surveillance footage, grainy but damning, surfaced from a dock in southern Europe. The image showed a man flanked by heavily armed guards, his gait, posture, and facial structure eerily identical to Nathan West. The resemblance was too exact, too undeniable, for Brennan to dismiss as coincidence. Then came another revelation. An informant embedded in the Middle East described a meeting where a man matching Peter August's description had overseen negotiations for a shipment of biological weapons. The source insisted that the man spoke with authority, issued orders without hesitation, and carried himself with the unmistakable aura of someone in command. Taken separately, these reports might have been explained away. Together, they formed a horrifying conclusion. Brennan's heart sank as he pieced the fragments into a single, impossible truth. Nathan West, once thought to have died a hero in the line of duty, and Peter August, long assumed to have met his end after years of betrayal and bloodshed, were alive. Not only alive, but commanding. They were the new architects of Faison's empire, inheriting the dark crown that so many had believed destroyed. The idea was grotesque. Nathan, a symbol of honor and loyalty, standing shoulder to shoulder with Peter, whose reputation for manipulation and cruelty had made him despised. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. The realization struck Brennan like a nightmare bleeding into daylight. Nathan's survival meant more than deception. It meant corruption of ideals. Had he been brainwashed, coerced, or broken by grief into turning against everything he once stood for? The possibilities haunted Brennan. Peter, on the other hand, was predictable in his treachery. He had always hovered on the periphery of villainy, and his rise to power seemed like the natural culmination of years spent in the shadows. But together, one man cloaked in the remnants of righteousness, the other armed with ruthless cunning, they formed a partnership uniquely suited to rebuilding a criminal empire in secrecy. What terrified Brennan most was not only that the organization endured, but that it had evolved. The world believed these men dead, and that illusion gave them the perfect camouflage. They could move in silence, manipulate resources, and extend their reach without the burden of suspicion. Every government agency, every intelligence service, every rival syndicate was blind to the truth. Only Brennan knew, and that knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders like a death sentence. He understood that he could not hesitate. If Nathan and Peter were allowed to continue unchecked, the network would swell into something far greater than Faison had ever dreamed of, a nightmare reborn with younger, sharper minds at its helm. Brennan began drafting a secret operation plan, one that bypassed traditional bureaucracy and filtered through only those he trusted absolutely. Precision and stealth were paramount. A single mistake could expose him, and if the brothers of Faison's legacy suspected surveillance, they would eliminate him without hesitation. In the solitude of his office, lit only by the dim glow of classified monitors, Brennan grasped the gravity of what he had uncovered. The specter of Faison had returned, but in a form more deceptive, more cunning, and more dangerous. Nathan and Peter were tightening their grip, weaving a web that threatened not just Port Charles but the fragile balance of international order. Every instinct screamed that the clock was ticking. Every misstep would bring him closer to death. But Brennan also knew this. He was the only one standing between the world and the resurrection of a monster thought long buried. After the devastating realization that Nathan and Peter had risen as the new leaders of Faison's empire, Brennan accepted that confronting them alone was tantamount to suicide. Their power structure was too intricate, woven into layers of international commerce, politics, and covert operations. Each strand of their network spread across borders like an invasive root system, resistant to eradication and impossible to sever in one clean stroke. One miscalculation would not simply compromise his mission, it would expose him, turning him into a target marked for swift elimination. He needed more than skill and secrecy. He needed a comprehensive strategy that would outmaneuver the men who thrived in shadows. Thus, Brennan devised a dual-track approach. The first track focused on evidence. He needed irrefutable proof, not whispers, not ambiguous intelligence, but hard data that could withstand scrutiny in both intelligence circles and, if necessary, the public arena. This meant collecting biometric confirmations, intercepted communications, corroborated eyewitness accounts, and financial records that tied Nathan and Peter directly to the machinery of the Faison network. Without this evidence, even the most meticulous operation would collapse under doubt or manipulation. The second track centered on allies, carefully chosen operatives whose loyalty could be trusted beyond procedural allegiance. Brennan knew he could not depend on the broader infrastructure of the WSB, which might already be compromised. What he required was a small, insulated circle capable of rapid, surgical strikes when the moment came. Central to this plan was Anna Devane. She was not just another operative. She was a strategist with scars, someone who had seen the cost of underestimating enemies like Faison. Her expertise in dismantling complex organizations, combined with her intuition for human weakness, made her the perfect counterpart. Yet involving Anna was a gamble. Her mistrust of Brennan was well documented. She knew his history of manipulation, the half-truths he wielded to achieve outcomes that served his agenda as much as his mission. If he approached her too aggressively, she would see through him and cut ties, possibly even expose him. Brennan understood this delicate balance. He could not present his findings outright. Doing so would raise more questions than answers about how he had obtained them. Instead, he would have to plant seeds, bits of verifiable intelligence that pointed toward the resurrection of Nathan and Peter, allowing Anna to piece together the truth herself. In her mind, the conclusion would be her own, and thus far more powerful than any claim he could make. To accomplish this, Brennan began curating the intelligence he had uncovered. Grainy surveillance stills were enhanced, but never perfected enough detail to provoke recognition without giving away the source. Intercepted audio was clean just enough to reveal familiar voices but left with the imperfections of plausible field recordings. Financial records were highlighted with deliberate omissions, creating trails that Anna's own instincts would feel compelled to follow. Each piece was designed not to overwhelm, but to intrigue, to push her toward the realization he needed her to reach. Nathan and Peter were alive, and they were no longer the men the world believed them to be. Behind these controlled disclosures, Brennan fortified his secondary network. Quiet contacts in Eastern Europe were reactivated, safe houses prepared, and a small cadre of operatives vetted under brutal scrutiny. He was ruthless in his selections, discarding anyone with even the faintest tie to questionable loyalties. The men and women he chose would not know the full scope of the mission, only the fragments necessary to play their roles. Compartmentalization was survival. If the organization had infiltrated international intelligence services, it was only a matter of time before word of his actions leaked. He needed to be invisible until the exact moment of the strike. Still, the weight of uncertainty pressed on him. How would Anna respond once she uncovered the truth? Would she be outraged at his concealment, or would she recognize the necessity of his methods? Brennan's gamble was that Anna's sense of justice would eclipse her distrust. If she came to believe Nathan and Peter were orchestrating a new reign of terror, she would not hesitate to act, even if it meant standing alongside him. Brennan knew he could not control her reaction, only the pathway she walked to arrive at it. For Brennan, this was not just a matter of strategy, it was a test of patience and precision unlike any he had ever endured. The stakes were immeasurable. A single misstep could collapse everything, leaving him exposed to enemies who operated without mercy. Yet the potential reward dismantling of a nightmare that had already cost countless lives was worth the risk. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by sealed dossiers and encrypted drives, Brennan reminded himself that every decision from this point onward had to serve the ultimate objective, not merely survival, but the eradication of a threat that should have died with Faison yet continued to grow in silence. In parallel with his cautious approach toward Anna, Brennan kept his eyes firmly on Jason Morgan. Jason's reputation was legendary, not because of government training or adherence to protocol, but because of his unique ability to operate where the law could not reach. He had survived countless battles that should have broken him, thrived in shadows where other men faltered, and above all, displayed an unshakable loyalty once he had identified a cause worth fighting for. Brennan understood that this loyalty, combined with Jason's lethal efficiency, made him the perfect weapon to be pointed at the heart of Faison's resurrected empire. If anyone could infiltrate strongholds too dangerous for official operatives, it was Jason. Brennan, however, also knew that Jason could not simply be ordered or manipulated into this war. His motivations were personal, deeply tied to those he loved, especially Jocelyn and the fragile safety of Port Charles. Thus, Brennan began sending indirect signals, subtle breadcrumbs designed to stir Jason's instincts without revealing the full scope of his operation. Reports of suspicious movements near Port Charles, encrypted messages referencing Jocelyn's name, and whispers of experiments targeting young innocents were allowed to drift into channels Jason would inevitably hear about. Brennan was orchestrating an echo, carefully amplifying the threat until Jason had no choice but to see the danger for himself and step into the arena. While baiting Jason into alignment, Brennan extended his reach across continents, establishing a latticework of double agents to monitor the arteries of Nathan and Peter's network. In Europe, operatives embedded themselves near key shipping routes, tracking containers that moved under diplomatic seals or with falsified medical exemptions. These were shipments ordinary customs officials would never question, yet Brennan's people knew to look for the telltale markers of illicit payloads. In South America, another team tracked financial transactions hidden within sprawling agricultural conglomerates and energy contracts. The laundering patterns were precise, but they carried the faint trace of Faison's old financial architecture, familiar enough for Brennan's analysts to unravel. Each discovery confirmed that the organization was not improvising, it was operating with the precision of a state-backed syndicate. The most dangerous part of Brennan's plan involved placing a mole directly inside the inner circle. He identified a candidate, an agent capable of erasing his past and slipping into the role of a loyal recruit. This operative would swear allegiance to Nathan, presenting himself as a disillusioned mercenary hungry for power and belonging. The objective was to penetrate deep enough to gain access to the command structure, to overhear names, schedules, and strategies. Brennan knew it was tantamount to a death sentence if the cover cracked. One wrong glance, one slip in tone, and the agent would be executed on the spot. Yet Brennan also knew that without such infiltration, the heart of the Empire would remain untouchable. Risk was not optional, it was the price of victory. Beyond infiltration, Brennan designed an elaborate trap. He manufactured the appearance of a high-value arms deal, involving cutting-edge weapons technology that Nathan and Peter's network would not be able to resist. Carefully falsified intel was leaked, suggesting that this technology would be moved through a neutral corridor under light security. The trap was multi-layered, the fake cargo was monitored at every step, communications channels seeded with deliberate inconsistencies, and operatives placed in positions to track anyone who took the bait. If Nathan or Peter surfaced, even indirect life breadcrumbs could lead Brennan's team closer to their physical location. The trap was not merely a lure, it was a diagnostic tool, meant to map the reflexes of the organization and expose its hidden arteries. All of this was conducted under a shroud of secrecy. Brennan trusted no one outside his insulated network, not even his superiors at the WSB. He had seen too much of Faison's influence burrowed into high command to risk exposure. Nathan and Peter had inherited not just Faison's empire, but his mastery of infiltration. If they had assets embedded within the world's most powerful institutions, then even a routine report could become a death warrant. To guard against discovery, Brennan rotated his safe houses, changed his routines with mechanical unpredictability, and even allowed decoy operations to collapse to mislead anyone tailing him. Every step was a balancing act between progress and survival. Yet even with every precaution, the psychological weight pressed on him relentlessly. He was no longer hunting mere criminals, he was preparing to confront men who had returned from death itself. Nathan's badge of honor as a former police officer gave him an aura of legitimacy, one that could shield his crimes from suspicion. People would believe him, trust him, even revere him. Peter's intellect and taste for manipulation turned him into the strategist, the puppeteer hidden behind the curtain. Together, they were a duality of authority and cunning, a combination more formidable than Brennan had ever encountered. The longer they remained unchecked, the more deeply their roots would sink into global systems. In the quiet hours of night, when Brennan reviewed the fragments of intelligence alone, he understood that the decisive moment was approaching. He could only keep the truth hidden for so long before others noticed the smoke and demanded answers. At some point, Anna would see the pattern, and Jason would feel the threat pressing against those he loved. Once they recognized the scale of the danger, there would be no turning back. The conflict would erupt into open war, dragging Port Charles into the vortex. The question that haunted Brennan was whether he had enough time to complete the scaffolding of his plan before Nathan and Peter struck first. He was racing against men who had already cheated death, men whose ambitions were sharpened by the illusion of invincibility. Brennan knew the cost of failure would not just be his life, but the destabilization of everything the world considered secure. He carried that weight with every calculated move, aware that the return of these phantoms from the past was not just a personal reckoning, it was a global catastrophe waiting to ignite.